Well, we'll go ahead and get started. Happy New Year, everyone. Welcome to the inaugural Nephrology Grand Rounds of 2022. And this morning we have our division head will be giving the first talk of the year, followed by the first biopsy conference of the year. So without further ado, Dr. Mehrotra.
Thank you, Matt. What I thought I would do today is to share something with you that I've learned wearing my editor's hat that I've been wearing now for the last 5 years. And that's about this complex issue of race in reporting research. So it is not as much a conversation about race generally and kidney disease. It is a very specific conversation around how should we be using race when reporting research. Just as an aside, financial conflict of interest is none. I'm the editor-in-chief for CJASN. That's where I've done all the learnings. And then I'm also the chair of the board of trustees at the Northwest Kidney Centers. The first question, I'm going to highlight two papers where I think we made a mistake in what appeared in the pages of CJASN. And the first paper was a paper that seemed to imply that there were differences observed by race that could be explained by biology. And there was this paper that actually looked at the differences in the risk factors for kidney stone by race. And there were clear differences that the authors described. There was nothing wrong in describing differences that exist by race. They exist, it's important that they be described. But I think in terms of the explanation that was offered for the difference was an argument that the difference was biologic. Perhaps there were differences, say, for example, in vasopressin levels that may affect the urine volumes that may differ by race. And the point of it is that the evidence that that is the case is extraordinarily thin. And I'm grateful to Christine, our fellow, who actually used this paper as an example in her work in progress presentation. And she was right in terms of questioning whether it was appropriate for us to have let the authors use biology to explain these differences by race. The second paper was about a year ago, and this is more to do with nomenclature. And nomenclature may seem like being woke, but nomenclature is very important to a journal editor. In terms of consistency and clarity of communication, nomenclature is extremely important. Here is this paper. This is the paper that we're extraordinarily proud of. This is the first paper that came out in CJASN that was actually picked up by CNN. And so this was describing a national cohort of veterans that had gotten COVID-19. And then they described the different risk groups that had a higher risk for COVID-19. And where it now says Black race, it used the word Blacks. This is something that was not on my radar. This is something that I actually did not know. And essentially, it is a problem when you use the racial designation as a noun. It is lumping individuals into stereotype groups, and it is not considered acceptable. And the person who raised this out is going to be an incoming fellow, Justin Bullock, who's at UCSF, and this is my first introduction to Justin. I remember we were vacationing in the Oregon coast when I kind of saw his tweet on social media, and I was mortified. And over that time, since about now 13 months ago, at that time, I engaged then with primarily Black nephrology professionals from around the country in terms of developing guidance for appropriate use of race in reporting research. And the product of this paper has not come out yet. This should come out any day. It is the process of that engagement has resulted in some of these leaders, for example, Ebony and Keith, to come up with this article that's going to come out maybe today or Monday about the use of race in kidney research and medicine. And some of the learnings that I've had over the years, I want to share with you and look forward to your feedback. I just see Bessie has joined, and I'm grateful to Bessie. She took a look at my slides and provided feedback as well to ensure that I captured the current concepts in reporting race in research. So there are 4 issues that I hope to address in my talk. I want to start with the definition of what is race, what is ethnicity, and what is racism. The second question is it necessary for human subject research to be race conscious? The third is, doesn't race provide biologically relevant information in ancestry? What about APOL1? And then finally, I'm going to end with the updated guidance from the AMA Manual of Style for reporting race and ethnicity that came out just 6 months ago. So what is race? If there's one thing I want people to take away from my presentation today, is an acknowledgement that race is a social construct without any scientific or biologic meaning. This is a very important, often not well understood concept, that it is a social construct without any scientific or biologic meaning. If you look at the Oxford English Dictionary, and I checked this up and was actually very enlightening, the first usage of the word race dates back to the 1500s. And the definitions that are relevant to humans are 2 definitions that I've put up again from the Oxford English Dictionary. It's a group of people that are connected by common descent or origin, or any of the putative groupings of mankind, usually defined in terms of distinct physical features or shared ethnicity. In fact, if you think about it, the racial groupings are based on rather superficial characteristics of skin color, hair texture, facial features, often linked to recent continental origin. And if you trace the history of use of race in medicine, it often starts with Carl Linnaeus. Carl Linnaeus was a botanist, and he lived in Sweden between 1707 to 1778. Remarkable scientist. It is to Carl that we owe, he's the father of taxonomy, the groupings that we are all well aware of in biology, such as phylum, genus, species, are all the work were first described by Carl Linnaeus. But he also, in addition to grouping plants and animals, he also described subgroups of humans. And this is actually from the book that he published in 1758. In which this is said to be the first description of human race in the context of science. And he identified 4 racial groups: Europaeus, Americanus, Asiaticus, and Africanus. Not only did he describe these 4 groups, he had these descriptors for them that were based on skin color and temperament, physical traits, behavior, manner of clothing, and form of government. And if you just focus on, I'm just going to focus on, for example, a few things in terms of skin color and temperament. People of European descent are white, sanguine, and muscular. People of Asian descent are sallow, melancholic, and stiff. And people of African descent are black, phlegmatic, and lazy. If you look at behavior, for example, in people that are American Indians, unyielding, cheerful, free. People of European descent are light, wise, and inventor. Asian origin are stern, haughty, and greedy. And of African descent are sly, sluggish, and neglectful. So I think you would agree with me that these are very superficial descriptors of how he perceived people of different continental origin to be, for him then to assign distinct racial groupings to people based primarily on continental origin. And it is essentially primarily continental origin, skin color, physical traits, and stereotypes of the time. There has been a long evolution then in describing race in the United States. And currently, if you look at all federal regulations and what is collected, for example, for the US Census, what is required by NIH when you're doing human subject research, are these groupings that more or less hew to what was described by Carl Linnaeus. This is American Indian, Alaska Native, Asian, Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, Black or African American, white, and more than one race. So what about ethnicity? Ethnicity, again, if you look at the Oxford English Dictionary, the first usage dates back to the late 1700s. And it's membership of a group regarded ultimately of common descent or having a common national or cultural tradition. So it refers to a person's cultural identity. For example, language, customs, and religion. And in the United States, formally, in terms of data collection by the federal government, ethnicity was introduced in 1980. And the definition of ethnicity, as far as the government of the United States is concerned, is two groupings, Hispanic or Latino, not Hispanic or Latino. Moving on to the third important concept, and that is the concept of racism. Essentially, this is Kamara Jones, who's actually one of the co-authors of the paper that has come out in CJASN, said this about 19 years ago. And it is a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on social interpretation of how one looks, that unfairly disadvantages some, unfairly advantages others, and saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. And people have further delved in deep into the different elements of racism. And I think what we understand more intuitively is the interpersonal or personally mediated racism, in which somebody uses pejorative terms and or talks down on people based upon their racial identity. But then there is also systemic, institutionalized, and structural racism, in which there are systems and policies that have historically disadvantaged and marginalized some communities, whether you have access to education or to healthcare or to employment, and you can go on and on. And then what I actually did not know this word up until I started preparing for this talk is this concept of internalized racism, when it is an individual of a disadvantaged group that has internalized negative feelings about their own worth. That they, like somebody who's a Black individual feels, and because they are Black, they are not good enough, for example. And that is what is internalized racism, in which you yourself are disadvantaging in who you perceive yourself to be. And so those are the three broad concepts of racism: of systemic, institutionalized, and structural, interpersonal and personally mediated, and internalized. I think I'm no expert in this, but the general sense is that over time, the interpersonal and personally mediated racism, at least, is not as overt as it used to be. The issues that are systemic, institutionalized, and structural, however, have remained largely unchanged over the years. So so my first point, that my first hope was to describe what is race, what is ethnicity, what is racism. What I've tried to tell you is that race descriptors are based on geographic origin and physical traits. Ethnicity designation reflects cultural identity. Racism is differential opportunities and advantages based on physical appearance. Let's go on to the second part. Should research be race conscious? There are large differences in risk of kidney failure. This is taken from the USRDS 2021 report. And as you can see, the lowest incidence of kidney failure is in people that are designated as white. Every other racial and ethnic subgroup in the United States has a higher incidence of kidney failure than the white population. The highest risk exists in people that are of in Black individuals, where the risk is almost threefold higher, over threefold higher than that for the white population. There are disparities in access to kidney transplantation. These are data from a recent paper that is looking at access to waitlisting preemptively, or actually receiving a deceased donor transplant preemptively. without the need for kidney transplant. And as you can see, that there are large, this is the rates for people that are white, this is for people that are Black. And so as you can see, there's a large gap in access to preemptive waitlisting as well as receiving a donor transplant. And there are disparities in people after they start dialysis. There are disparities in waitlisting and transplant after initiation of dialysis. We've looked at this. This is something that is close to my heart in terms of access to home dialysis. And as you can see, every racial and ethnic group other than individuals that are white have a lower access to home dialysis than people that are white. And that is true for PD as well as for home heme. And we looked at access to transplant in the subgroup of people that are on dialysis that are doing home dialysis. And even in that subgroup, there were disparities in access to transplant. You would think that people that are doing home dialysis are more engaged in their care because they're doing their dialysis at home. And so patient level factors that are barriers to transplant be less operative. But even in this, there were large disparities in access to kidney transplantation. And then we've learned about disparities during the COVID-19 pandemic. Racial and ethnic minority groups have a higher risk for infection, whether or not they have kidney disease. They have a higher risk for developing acute kidney injury. They have a higher mortality. They have lower enrollment in trials for the vaccine, and they've had slower access to the vaccines. So the second point that I wanted to illustrate in terms of race and research is to make the point that human subject research, it'd be imperative for it to be race conscious when appropriate. The disease burden and access to treatment differs by race. It can only be determined if research is race conscious. And it helps in ensuring equity in access to potential benefits from research, such as early access to newer treatments. This pandemic, a lot of the focus has been, for example, in early access to the vaccine. It is also critical, I think I don't have the time to get into this, is to measure outcomes at the level of a health system. So for example, within UW Medicine or at Northwest Kidney Centers, for example, that we're so proud of the care that we deliver. Are we delivering equitable care? We can only know if we measure it by race and by ethnicity. In contrast, there is no place for race in clinical algorithms because it is, I'm just moving this, pardon me, this, having a little trouble. All right, let's just go on to the next part. Doesn't race inform us about ancestry? That's the next point I want to address. One of the major advances in our field has been the identification of ApoL1 and its association with the risk for kidney disease. This is just a cartoon that illustrates the structure of the ApoL1 gene. It is the ApoL1 protein. And this is a protein that is important for innate immunity. It is located on chromosome 22. And this is the sequence of amino acids for the wild type variant for the ApoL1. There is a G1 variant where there are two mutations. At position 342, there is a guanine instead of a serine, and at 384, where there's a methionine instead of isoleucine. So it is illustrated right here. Instead of an S, there is a G. Instead of an I, there is an M. And the allele frequency in people with recent African ancestry is about 23%. So 1 in 4 people with recent African ancestry have a G1 genotype, at least one allele of the G1 genotype. And then you have the G2 genotype, where there is a deletion of 2 amino acids, one at position 388 and another at position 389. The N and the Y are deleted. It is less frequent, has an allele frequency of 15%. So G1 and G2 are gain of function variants in people with recent African ancestry. It further enhances the protection against some trypanosoma subspecies. And the way it is important to think about ApoL1 is not simply whether they have one allele of G1 or one allele of G2. The high risk alleles are when you have 2 copies of the high risk gene. So which will be either you have a G1, G1, or you have a G2, G2, or you have a G1, G2. A G1, G0 is not a high-risk allele. A G2, G0 is not a high-risk allele. And if you look at, again, people with recent African ancestry, 87% of people do not have a high-risk APOL1 gene genotype. 13% have a high-risk APOL1 genotype. And there's a whole range of diseases, kidney diseases, that have been associated with APOL1 high-risk genotype. And this is, I think, a very nice illustration of the magnitude of risk that has been described for different diseases. At the highest end of the spectrum are collapsing FSGS type of diseases, right? So interferon-associated FSGS, HIVAN in Africa, HIVAN in the United States, FSGS in general, the risk is between 17 to 90-fold higher in people that are the high-risk APOL1 genotype versus those that don't. The second group of diseases goes into these two broad groups. Essentially, one is like hypertensive ESRD, the catch-all phrase, and in people with lupus. And you can see that the risk is between 2.5 to 7-fold. What is important is that there is absolutely no increase in risk for diabetic kidney disease or for other common diseases, such as for IgA nephropathy. So the question that I'm trying to address right now is, doesn't race tell us about ancestry? Doesn't ancestry tell us about kidney disease risk? Isn't using race useful? Let me just start off by saying that we just talked about certain diseases where the risk is very greatly increased. But then you look at these large disparities in the burden for diabetic kidney disease where APOL1 is not a player. You can see the incidence of diabetic kidney failure is more than 2-fold higher in people that are Black compared to people that are white. And this is not because of APOL1. There's also a much greater genetic diversity within Africa and African Americans than in any other global population that has been studied. This is a very nice paper in Science some years ago. It studied 121 African populations, 4 African American populations, and 60 non-African populations, and came up with 14 ancestral population clusters with self-defined race identity. And you can just look at some of these as like Saharan Africa, Western Africa, Southern Africa, African American, Central Africa, and on and on. And ancestry of African Americans is 71% from the Niger Kordofanian ancestry, 13% of European ancestry, and 8% from other African populations. If you look at the distribution of the APOL1 genotype, and this is actually how I kind of stumbled in this actually at one of our professor rounds at Harborview, where we had a patient that was an African immigrant who had AIDS and he had proteinuric kidney disease, and we were discussing the differential diagnosis. And the question that was raised, is it fair to assume that they have HIVAN? Turns out that person was a Kenyan or an Ethiopian immigrant, and clearly would be inappropriate for us to attribute an APOL1 high-risk genotype to them. As you can see, primarily APOL1 genotype is distributed in people in West Africa. Look at Sudan, where there is virtually no APOL1 high-risk genotypes. Look at Ethiopia, look at Somalia. These are countries where there is virtually no individuals that have the high-risk APOL1 genotype that we, within quotes, associate with people of African ancestry. I would just argue to be very careful in applying population-based associations of ancestry with disease risk for decision-making for an individual patient. I think one has to be extremely careful in doing that. So is race equal to ancestry is equal to kidney disease risk? My take is that no. Risk is increased only for some types of kidney disease. High-risk alleles are present only in some parts of Africa. Only 13% of people of recent African ancestry have high-risk genotypes. 87% don't. Most people with high-risk genotypes don't get kidney disease. And estimates suggest that only 30% of the excess risk of kidney disease in Black Americans is from APOL1. 70% is not explained. And the major mechanistic pathways for excess risk are primarily social determinants of health, which is access to appropriate housing, food insecurity, barriers to education and employment, access to health insurance and health care, exposure to pollutants and inequitable impact of climate change that leads to lifestyle implications that result in altered kidney pathophysiology. I don't have time to go into the entire field that has tested the biologic effects of perceived racism, that in individuals that are exposed to racism, there are biologic changes that happen in the body as described by the allostatic load, gene expression, sympathetic nervous system activity that further feed into the risk. And so that major mechanistic pathway is to do with social determinants of health, structural racism, and racial discrimination. So how does that then feed into reporting research? And I wanted to share with you this guidance that came out in August 2021 from the American Medical Association, which is on the reporting of race and ethnicity in medical and science journal. And we follow that in CJASN to a large extent, and we have work to do in this regard as well. So it acknowledges things that I've already said, that race and ethnicity are social constructs. It's important that the written word, which is the journal's purview, be accurate, clear, and precise. Each word has been chosen very carefully. So it is not a cavalier use of the English language here. And it should reflect fairness, equity, and consistency. Reporting or considering race and ethnicity in isolation is generally inappropriate. And I use the word generally, that's mine, because there are circumstances where it may not be, but it is generally inappropriate. It's important to provide contextual information of other socio-demographic factors and consider the intersectionality of social determinants of health with race and ethnicity. The recommended practice is if you're writing a manuscript that is describing race, it is important for you to include how was race and ethnicity determined. Was it self-report? Was it investigator observed? Was it from a database, medical records, survey instrument? It's important to use specific categories over collective terms. List the categories that were used for data collection, and the categories should be listed alphabetically. I have 2 more slides, and I'll be done quickly. So there are these glossaries, so to say, of preferred terms and non-preferred terms that I'll go through quickly. The first is it's important to use the phrase race and ethnicity rather than race/ethnicity, because the slash implies and or, and that usually is not right. It's all right to use racial and ethnic minority groups. It is inappropriate to use the word minorities because it implies hierarchy. The majority is the superior, minority is the inferior. Others, like a racial descriptor of others, is considered pejorative. It's important, it's all right to use a group called others, but it's important then to describe who was included in others. Because sometimes there may not just be enough people in a group for you to describe them individually, but it'd be important to kind of outline that. Mixed race is non-specific. It's important to define multiracial or multi-ethnic. The implications of somebody that is multiracial, as in being white and black, is different than, say, white and Asian or black and Asian. They're different racial groupings. It's important to know what is determined. People of color and non-white are not considered appropriate. It's important to use specific categories. Do not use Caucasian, because Caucasian implies people from the Caucasus region. Most people identified as white actually are not from the Caucasus region. American Indian or Alaskan Native is preferred, not Native American. And as a last, it's important to capitalize race and ethnicity designation and use it as an adjective and not as a noun. So what I've tried to say in the last 30 minutes or so is that race and ethnicity are social constructs. Ancestry provides important information about disease risk, but race is not the same as ancestry. The discovery of ApoL1 is a seminal finding. It explains higher risk for some kidney diseases, and it is also being used as a therapeutic target and may result in new treatments along the way. There are large disparities in risk for kidney disease and access to care. And so research and reporting for research should be equity-driven, race-conscious. And the recent guidance from the AMA and CJASN provides such a template. And I'll stop with this recommendation from Stuart, actually recommended this book to me. Those of you that have not read this book, Cast, it is a powerful read, and I highly recommend it. So with that, I'll stop now. And I think I'm a minute over, Matt. Sorry for that.
No worries. Perhaps time for maybe one question. I
think Steve, go ahead. Yeah, I think you said you have a question. Go ahead.
Go ahead,
Yeah.
Steve.
Thanks. I was wondering if you could give us advice. Thanks for a great review on a complex topic. I was wondering if you can give us some editor's advice on a broader subject of publication, because we're publishing teaching materials and we're publishing all our presentations. And for years, a lot of us have used ethnicity and race in teaching. For example, hypokalemic periodic paralysis, we may say increased risk in Asian males, and our problem stems would have Asian male as the person. What's your advice for using such constructs in just our regular teaching and our presentations when we're not going back and doing a complex review of every single item that we're teaching? Should we just stop that? Or
I can say I can answer that at least partly wearing my ABIM hat. At least if you look at any of the questions that come from the ABIM, it will not include a race descriptor unless it is absolutely necessary. So unless the clinical understanding of the case is dependent upon the inclusion of race, it is not important to include race. I mean, I particularly, I am of Indian descent. All of you know that. I actually, when I look at people, when descriptors, for example, there are people in this audience that may know this more than I do. For example, people say IgA nephropathy is more common in Asians. I actually don't know is in people of Indian heritage if there's a higher risk of IgA nephropathy. I don't know. It is extrapolated from studies of Chinese populations and of Japanese populations and Korean populations. So I don't know, when you talk about periodic paralysis, a disease as rare as that, how strong the evidence is. It's best to stay away unless you're certain.
okay, thank you.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Raj, for launching Grand Rounds in 2022.